The Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. The Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. This morning, we welcome EPA Administrator Wheeler to the Subcommittee to discuss the President's proposed fiscal year 2020 budget for the agency. Mr. Wheeler, thank you for being here. When your predecessor last testified, we were tough, but in my opinion, fair, given his record. While I am relieved that you have not continued his pattern of indiscretions and ethical violations, I do have serious concerns about the course this agency, the EPA, has plotted under your leadership. And I believe my colleagues on this side of the dais will have questions and disagreements on policies your agency has been putting forth. The President, as we all know, has proposed a 31% cut to EPA's budget from last year's levels. The House will certainly reject this budget, which would undermine the agency's ability to fulfill its basic mission, that being of protecting Americans' health and our environment. I'm also concerned and confused that the President's proposal includes significant reductions to programs that the administration publicly claims are top priorities. For example, Administrator Wheeler has called unsafe drinking water the greatest environmental threat, but the budget fails to reflect that sentiment. Bipartisan legislation that originated in this committee last year reauthorized funding for the Drinking Water Safe Revolving Fund at some $1.3 billion in fiscal year 20. But President Trump's request is far less than even last year's level. The committee has recognized the need to protect our drinking water. With that in mind, I hope to receive updates on the lead service line replacement grant program, the lead and copper rule revision rulemaking, which was expected in February, and the regulatory determination for PFAS, which your agency has said will happen this year. EPA is not acting urgently or comprehensively enough to address serious risks to Americans that go beyond our drinking water. Administrative actions have moved through the agency that will undermine protections for clean air and chemical safety. But perhaps the clearest example is the agency's climate change agenda. The administration has sought to undo modest and achievable climate protections, including gutting the Clean Power Plan and vehicle emission standards. The administrator's recent remark that climate is not a very urgent threat is not supported by science and ignores the countless families losing their homes to hurricanes, to flooding, and to wildfires. We are spending billions of dollars each year responding to natural disasters, and we know that climate pollution emitted today will stay in the atmosphere for decades. There is no excuse for sitting on our hands. We need to be doing much more to rein in emissions, and right now. There are meaningful and non-controversial steps EPA could take on this front. One easy example is to strengthen the popular consumer-friendly Energy Star program. It is my understanding that Mr. Wheeler has not been directly involved with this program, but I have been informed that actual spending on the program is significantly less than what Congress has directed in recent years. That is not how this is supposed to work. This program is critically important to Americans' consumers and manufacturers, so I hope this concern will be raised with the appropriate people at EPA. Congress does expect our spending directions to be followed. In addition to advancing the mission of the agency to safeguard public health, I also believe the administrator has a responsibility to protect the health of the institution. And yet we continue to see employees leave, including engineers and scientists with decades of experience and knowledge. These dedicated public servants are being replaced at much lower rates. We're seeing a lax approach to enforcement of existing laws. Enforcement actions against polluters have reached a 25-year low under this administration. The agency has stressed allowing polluters to self-report violations, all while conducting fewer inspections to catch them if they are breaking the law. That is not just taking the cop off the beat. It is asking the lawbreakers to come down to the station at their own convenience. We are also seeing a systematic devaluing of science by the agency's leadership. Robust science was included as a major goal in the budget, but science funding was recommended for a 45% proposed cut. When EPA ignores science in its decision-making, we are essentially ensuring that Americans will be put in unnecessary danger. Americans will get sicker, and they will die sooner. It is critical that public health rules be grounded in robust science, but instead we are witnessing the continued dismissal, politicization, and suppression of science at the agency. Finally, more must be done to improve transparency. When we ask for documents or urge EPA to be more transparent or responsive, we're not trying to set up a gotcha. We do it because it is our job to conduct oversight of the agency on behalf of the American people, the people we are all charged with serving and the people this agency is charged with protecting. I hope this morning that Administrator Wheeler, you will renew your commitment to deliver thorough and timely responses to our requests. Mr. Wheeler, again, thank you for joining us. I look forward to your testimony. With that, I now recognize the Mr. Shimkus, our Republican leader for the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join you in welcoming Administrator Wheeler before our committee today to discuss the President's proposed budget for fiscal year 2020 for the Environmental Protection Agency. We appreciate you being here today, Administrator, and look forward to our discussions. It's also, just going off script here, it's good to see behind you Ryan Jackson. For those on the committee who were around during the TSCA legislation, Ryan was our point of contact with Senator Inhofe. I'll be asking questions on that. So maybe, Administrator, you want to talk to Ryan, find out what our intent was and what we're trying to do. But Ryan, it's great to see you again, so thanks. Mr. Chairman, this Congress is not the first time that I have been the lead Republican on this subcommittee or some version of it. Some of you may know this, but I was also lead Republican on this subcommittee in the 110th Congress. That Congress followed 12 years of Republican control of the House and a new Democrat majority. Was eager to bring the Republican-run EPA to criticize their budget proposal because it wasn't as robust as the majority felt as necessary. I left that hearing that day with a couple of thoughts in mind. First, the Constitution gives Congress a sole authority to raise and spend revenue. So when Congress examines administration budget requests, as we are today, we cannot divorce ourselves and our decisions from that discussion. Speaker Pelosi often says, "Show me your budget," and I'll show you our values. And I think that's true. I'm glad we have a budget proposal from the EPA to warrant today's hearing. As I understand it is unlikely that the House will have an opportunity to vote on a budget proposal of our own this year. My second thought from the 2010 hearing is that we need to know that what we are getting a good return on our investment in environmental protection for the billions we are giving the Environmental Protection Agency to spend. There are lots of worthy ideas and programs that the EPA could address, but does it make the most sense to have EPA be the one to do everything all the time? We should not advocate for more funding if all of it is buying us bureaucracy, regulatory confusion with other agencies, or woke-sounding programs that don't really improve public health and the environment. Finally, and to tie both points together, the money is not the end-all, be-all when it comes to an agency's success. More money does not necessarily make a person care about their environment. There are other considerations, including fidelity to the laws Americans ask us to pass, stewardship of the agency to ensure it is doing the best it can with what it has, concrete metrics that can demonstrate progress is being made, and responsiveness to the environmental and public health concerns of the American people. Before I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman, I do want to thank Administrator Wheeler for some of his recent comments regarding safe drinking water. As our colleagues on this subcommittee know, improvements and reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act was a bipartisan priority and a success of the last Congress. I applaud you, Administrator, for recognizing that access to safe drinking water is the most imminent environmental threat we face globally. Again, welcome Administrator Wheeler, and I look forward to asking you questions later this morning. I thank the Chairman for yielding me this time and for holding this important hearing. And with that, seeing no one else wanting my remainder of the time, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement. Chairman Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A budget is an expression of priorities, and it should be clear to anyone reading the EPA budget proposal that President Trump does not prioritize public health or the environment. The budget would cut EPA funding by 31%, more than any other cabinet-level agency. It would eliminate important programs like beach grants that help coastal communities like mine ensure that the water is safe to swim in. It also fails to deliver on many of the promises the Trump administration has made on dangerous toxins like lead and PFAS. And today we'll have an opportunity to measure EPA's progress over the past year, since the subcommittee heard from then Administrator Pruitt on EPA's budget last year. That hearing last year showed bipartisan concern about Administrator Pruitt's scandals, agency mismanagement, and repeated attacks on public health. And when Administrator Pruitt resigned, there was hope on both sides of the aisle that the situation at EPA would improve. And I was pleased when Mr. Wheeler, then the acting administrator, personally committed to make staff available to the committee for briefings and to testify. Unfortunately, when I look at the past year, it does not seem that EPA has come very far. In fact, on some issues, it seems the agency's actually moved backward. When Administrator Wheeler at the helm, EPA has continued to attack science, transparency, and public health, and the agency is working to abandon action on climate change and air quality, in my opinion. EPA scrapped the sensible carbon reduction requirements in the Clean Power Plan and replaced it with a scam that is more costly and less protective than no rule at all. EPA also walked away from negotiations with California over the Trump administration's rollback of clean air standards, and Administrator Wheeler publicly vowed to revoke California's waiver to implement stronger vehicle pollution control requirements. And in a move that I think makes absolutely no sense, EPA took the first step on a path to sabotage the successful mercury and air toxic standards. These standards protect communities from dangerous mercury and hazardous air pollution that's spewed from coal and oil-burning power plants. This action is so bad that even the power industry opposed it. So I'm very concerned that EPA's implementation also of the revised Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, is leaving workers, children, low-income communities, communities of color, and the general public at an unacceptable risk. The regulation of asbestos is still heading in the wrong direction. EPA is still allowing new uses of asbestos under the new chemical program and still ignoring legacy asbestos exposures in its risk assessment. And last month, the EPA finalized a rule on methylene chloride that fell far short of what is needed to protect public health and was what was promised to this committee and me. EPA is also still working to remove important protections in the risk management planning program that might have prevented or reduced the impacts of 2 recent fires in the Houston area. So I also remain concerned that a lot of troubling activities that began on Administrator Pruitt's watch are still happening. EPA is still hiring industry lobbyists as regulators, and that raises red flags on ethics issues. It's also still shortening comment periods, hiding science from the American public, and refusing to provide requested documents to Congress. Now, members of both parties in both the House and the Senate are unable to get answers from EPA and the administration. And this is unacceptable because Congress must be able to conduct oversight. The agency's refusal to provide information also creates a distinct impression that the EPA is something to hide. So the track record of the EPA over the last 2 years is abysmal, in my opinion. I'm hoping, Mr. Wheeler, that we can look forward, well, I look forward to your testimony and hope that we can begin some changes and answers to these committee's questions today. And with that, unless someone else wants my time, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Seeing no one, the gentleman yields back. In the absence of the Republican leader of the full committee, Mr. Walden, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the recognition, and I'm sure if Chairman Walden were here, he would offer these words himself. But I'd like to welcome our fellow Ohioan and EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler this morning. Because of Mr. Wheeler's years of experience as a special assistant at the Pollution Prevention and Toxics Office and as a majority staff director and counsel at Senate EPW, and through his work with stakeholders affected by EPA regulations, I know the EPA's mission and objectives are in good hands. It is possible to have both a vibrant and growing economy along with sound policies that protect our environment. These goals are not mutually exclusive, and I know Administrator Wheeler understands that, especially as the agency works on critical drinking water issues, continued TSCA implementation, and cleaning up and redeveloping contaminated lands, while simultaneously seeking to reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens for our small businesses and job creators. So, Mr. Wheeler, thank you for being here today and for your testimony on EPA's FY 2020 budget. These are really important issues, and I look forward to the discussion. With that, unless someone else wants some time, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I now have the pleasure of introducing our witness for today's hearing, the Honorable Andrew Wheeler, Administrator of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Before we begin, I would like to explain the lighting system. In front of you, Administrator, are a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red and when your time expires. And at this time, the Chair will recognize Administrator Wheeler for 5 minutes to provide his opening statement. Welcome, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Taco, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the subcommittee. I'm joined by Holly Greaves, EPA's CFO, and we are here today to discuss EPA's proposed 2020 budget. The budget resolution ensures that the agency can continue President Trump's bold agenda and the tremendous progress we have made over the past 2 years. The U.S. is a global leader in clean air and access to safe drinking water, and we are cleaning up contaminated lands at the fastest pace in over a decade. At the same time, EPA has finalized 38 deregulatory actions, saving Americans more than $3 billion in regulatory costs, and we have an additional 39 actions in development proposed to save billions more. The Trump administration is proving that environmental protection and historic economic growth can go hand in hand. My testimony will highlight how the President's budget will continue this progress. I believe that water issues, from drinking water to marine litter to infrastructure, are the largest and most immediate environmental issue facing the world today. The budget request provides critical support for water quality protection. One challenge we face is lead exposure. Through the new Federal Lead Action Plan, EPA is coordinating with our federal counterparts to reduce childhood lead exposure. Last week, we issued a status report to hold ourselves accountable to the public and clearly communicate the steps we are taking to implement the action plan. To bolster these efforts, the budget proposes $50 million to establish a new Healthy Schools grant program to reduce exposure to lead and other toxins in schools. We're also moving forward to update the lead and copper rule for the first time in over 2 decades. Our proposal would ensure that we address the most corrosive pipes in the most at-risk communities first. Another challenge is addressing potential sources of contamination. In February, EPA released its PFAS Action Plan, the most comprehensive multimedia research and action plan ever issued by the agency to address an emerging chemical of concern. On the marine litter issue, billions of pounds of waste enter our oceans each year, harming marine life and coastal economies. EPA's Trash-Free Waters program is stepping up to help the international community capture marine litter or prevent it from reaching the ocean. On infrastructure, the President's budget includes a 25% increase to WIFIA from last year's request. This new program is already producing tremendous results. Today, EPA has issued 8 WIFIA loans totaling more than $2 billion in federal credit assistance. I was in Miami-Dade County on Friday to announce a $99 billion WIFIA loan to help protect Florida's beaches and water resources. We recently announced our 3rd round of funding, which could support $12 billion in water infrastructure projects and create more than 180,000 jobs. To expand on these efforts, President Trump signed America's Water Infrastructure Act, or AWIA. While funding for AWIA was not included in fiscal year 2019 appropriations that Congress enacted, EPA does propose funding of $83 million in this budget request to begin implementation of this important new law. The budget request also includes approximately $2 billion in federal dollars towards the 2 SRFs. The combination of federal grants, state matches, repayments, and interest all flow back into each revolving fund, creating $80 billion in the nationwide fund as of this year. Regarding the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, as the President stated, this is a unique and important program, and I fully support his decision as it relates to funding the program. When it comes to reducing air pollution, we're moving forward with common sense reforms that will help more communities reach attainment of the NAAQS standards. For example, last week we announced that the Cleveland area is now meeting the standards for particulate matter. The cleanup of contaminated lands also plays a crucial role in revitalizing communities throughout the country. In fiscal year 2018, EPA deleted all or part of 22 sites from the National Priorities List, the largest number of deletions in 1 year since fiscal year 2005. Our next responsibility is ensuring that chemicals used in commerce and sold in the marketplace are safe for public use. I'm proud to report that EPA continues to meet the major statutory deadlines of the amended TSCA. Earlier this month, we finalized a ban on retail sales of methylene chloride for consumer paint and coating removal, the first risk management action under Section 10 of amended TSCA. To ensure our efforts are effective and durable, EPA has a healthy and robust enforcement program. At one end of the spectrum, we are increasing compliance through self-audits, which are often the quickest way to correct environmental harms. At the other end of the spectrum, we're deterring noncompliance by increasing the number of new criminal cases, reversing a downward trend that began in 2011. This is the type of leadership that gives confidence to the public, the regulated community, and our allies around the globe. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. That concludes the Administrator's opening statement. We'll now move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witness, and I'll point out that we're going to stay very strict with the 5 minutes because I'm told the Administrator has a hard out at 12:30, is it? So we'll be very strict about the 5-minute effort. Since our witness can only be here to 12:30, we're going to be moving forward now with questions of our guest. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Administrator Wheeler, in the past we have spoken about the Strengthening Transparency and Regulatory Science proposed rule, which is issued by your predecessor and widely criticized by the scientific community. Can you provide us an update on the status of that proposal?
We're still working on that. We intend to move forward with it. You know, it's important. There's been a lot of criticism. I think a lot of the criticism is from people who don't fully understand what we're doing with the proposal. I cut my teeth at EPA on the community right to know, and I believe the more information we make available to the public, the more robust our regulations will be.
So when can we expect, you know, a better proposal that's outlined for us?
Before the end of this year.
Okay, and how EPA chooses to collect and evaluate scientific research is an incredibly important step in the regulatory process, including for assessing a chemical's potential risks under the TSCA law. Before your confirmation to this position, you sent a letter to Senator Carper where you committed to submit EPA's systematic review method for TSCA risk evaluations to the National Academy of Sciences for review and to make public any feedback that the agency receives. What is the status of that National Academy review?
I believe we've submitted some of the data so far, but it's for the first 10 chemicals, and those risk assessments aren't supposed to be finished until the end of this year.
Will the Academy have complete discretion to select scope and membership of the review team?
I believe so. I don't believe we can even dictate to the Academy who's on the review
So
team.
they'll have complete discretion?
Yes, is my understanding.
In 2017, the Office of Research and Development developed a review report for the Office of Pesticides Programs on the epidemiology and health effects research regarding exposure to glyphosate. Why was the work not included in your public release of that research, and will you release it now?
I'm sorry, I have to get back to you on that. I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS handbook, was ready for release in December of 2018. Will you publicly release the IRIS handbook now?
I don't believe it was ready for release. I believe we're still working through the handbook. I don't believe it's ready to be released yet, but it will be released.
When should we anticipate that the effort will be
back to the
completed?
deadline for that.
Formaldehyde was recently designated as a high priority candidate for risk evaluation under TSCA. It has also been the subject of a long delayed review under IRIS. What is the status of the IRIS formaldehyde assessment, and will that work inform the risk evaluation process under TSCA?
Yes, that work will inform the risk evaluation under TSCA. At this point, we're not moving forward with the IRIS review. We decided to put formaldehyde through TSCA. If you put a chemical through the TSCA program, you can regulate the chemical at the end of the process. IRIS is not a regulatory mechanism.
Well, will the IRIS assessment be released for interagency review? And what are the plans for external scientific peer review?
What we did last summer was go back to all of our program offices and ask them what their high priority chemicals are for IRIS. And formaldehyde did not come back as one of the high priority chemicals selected. If we were to move forward with the formaldehyde IRIS assessment, it would be a minimum of 18 months. And we decided that it was more important to go ahead and put formaldehyde through the TSCA program, because at the end of the day, we can regulate formaldehyde under TSCA. You cannot regulate a chemical under IRIS.
Given TSCA's requirement to make publicly available all health and safety data being used in risk evaluations, when can we expect the IRIS formaldehyde assessment to be released?
We're not planning on moving forward with the IRIS assessment for formaldehyde. We're moving forward under TSCA.
Mr. Wheeler, going back to the transparency and science proposed rule, the proposal indicated that the administrator would be empowered to grant exemptions at his discretion to address issues on a case-by-case basis. Do you have any thoughts as to how an administrator should go about granting exemptions if this proposal moves forward?
I think if there is an important scientific study where the data is not available to the public, the administrator should weigh whether or not it's important to move forward with that study as part of the regulatory process. And I believe that that is a decision that administrators could make on a case-by-case basis. But it's important to remember that the proposal only is for studies going forward. It's not retroactive.
Well, I believe Mr. Pallone may ask about PB29, but we have seen EPA under your leadership keep data and reports hidden for the benefit of industry, even when it was not allowable under the law in the case of PB29, all while promoting a transparency rule which scientific and medical experts say will make it more difficult for EPA to use robust science in its rulemaking process. I urge you to release the reports I have raised, along with others, which I intend to submit for the record. With that, I yield back, and I recognize Representative Shimkus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Wheeler, I want to focus my questions in 2 areas of interest: the substantial backlog of applications in the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, new chemicals provision, and the renewable fuel standard. According to the agency's website, as of 3 weeks ago, the number of notices awaiting completion of review since this law was enacted 34 months ago was 62%, higher than the historical caseload of new chemical applications. More importantly, though, is that to avoid delays in getting innovative, greener, safer chemicals to the market. And I mean, that's one of the benefits. We want to get safer chemicals to the market versus chemicals that we may not be as safe that's in the market right now. TSCA specifically mandates completion of new chemical reviews within 90 days, but not later than 180 days. How many of those 527 pending applications are older than 180 days?
270 at this point. And it is lower than what it was. We are working to reduce the backload. It's been within the time frames for both the new chemicals and the existing chemicals program under the new TSCA. There's been some challenges, but we're processing them faster than we were a year ago.
Right, and the media asks me about this like every week. So that's why I don't think it's any surprise that I'm going down this part of the questioning, because the whole idea is to get this process moving. How many are older of these 527 or whatever were 90 days, older than 90 days?
Older than 90 days would be 110 to 120 in the over 90 but under 180.
So are these delays an EPA labor or a legal problem?
It's more a labor problem at this point. We had to work through the program on how the program is going to be implemented, and during that, working through the implementation phase, we got the backlog. So we're trying to process the new chemicals as they come in as quickly as possible, and also work on the backlog. But
right.
Do you have out to manufacturers to let them know about the timing on a case-by-case basis?
Do you have a plan to devote resources to addressing the backlog of old pre-manufactured notices that have been languishing for many months or years?
We do, and we have been, you know, and it is in part a staffing problem. Last year, we hired 25 new people to work on TSCA, but at the same time, we lost 25 people. So it's kind of keeping our head above water at times on staffing.
Will you try to quickly place more experienced scientists and engineers in the TSCA program to complete more timely new chemical reviews and risk evaluations?
Yes.
I think that's your answer that preceded my question. Before my time concludes, I want to touch on the renewable fuel standard. I see David Lobsek here. I'm sure he's going to direct some questions in that area. Also, as you know, after 2022, EPA has a great deal more flexibility to set the targets in the RFS. Has the agency already begun to prepare for the RFS post-2022?
No. Right now, we are focused on the E15, the RIN price mechanism, the reset, the RVO for this year, and
you got some other issues on your plate.
We've got 5 pending regulations on the RFS.
Well, and as you know, we were trying to do something legislative with statutory and law that would help give you more direction. I think
That would be great.
I still think that's very, very important because this 2022 debate is real.
It is.
We don't know if you'll be there. We don't know if we'll have a new administration. We don't know who the new EPA administrator would be. It's kind of a roll of the dice, don't you think?
Yes, I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to take place between now and 2022. And while the administration, I don't believe, has an official position on RFS legislation, I do think the program could, for post-2022, would be strengthened by congressional views on this.
Do you expect the demand for biofuel would be higher, lower, or about the same? Again, I'm talking a crystal ball. Where do you think we're headed in just biofuel in the mix?
Post-2022? Well, I mean, it really depends on the use of fuel in the automobile industry. You know, I worked as a staffer on both the 2005, 2007 energy bills, and at that point in time, we did not project the vehicle miles traveled would be going down or the gasoline usage would be going down. We thought it would be going up, and the legislation, as you remember, was drafted with the expectation that we would continue to use more gasoline, and that hasn't been the case with more fuel-efficient cars, electric vehicles, natural gas-powered vehicles. So, and there's a lot of drivers as far as the fuel usage, and then but increasing, like the E15 should also help increase the volumes for ethanol.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start with two thank yous you may not get from this side of the aisle. One is I think I'm the only former EPA employee on the committee. I worked in the TSCA program. And though they need people, I'm done with that particular phase of my career.
We could use you. I think there's some forms.
Use more help.
Also, so on their behalf, I want to say I'm a little concerned about the cuts in general. I think that these people work very hard. They do important work, and we need to support them. I also want to thank you for the loan that San Diego received, $614 million loan for our water recycling project known as Pure Water. And connected with that, though, as you pointed out, that's a very important program. Unfortunately, you're requesting $300 million less than the enacted level in 2019. I'll just, without don't have time to go into that, but I'll just flag, I think that's the wrong way to go for such an important program that provides so much leverage to communities for environmental protection. But I did want to talk about the U.S.-Mexico Border Water Infrastructure Program, or BWIP. As you know, the city of San Diego has for decades struggled to end the continuous discharge of sewage along the border into the city from Tijuana. Millions of gallons of sewage still routinely close beaches. In FY 2020, you propose eliminating resources and staff for the U.S.-Mexico Border Water Infrastructure Program. The program's, quote, supports the planning, design, and construction of water and wastewater treatment facilities along the border, with all projects benefiting communities on the U.S. side of the border. The EPA has identified nearly $125 million in drinking water and wastewater infrastructure projects along the border in need of funding to protect public health and environmental impact in the United States. And yet the budget would eliminate the U.S.-Mexico border program as part of the effort to focus resources on core environmental work. Now, since the program began in 1997, it's provided hundreds of thousands of U.S. households along the border adequate drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. Initially funded with $100 million per year, however, it's been reduced over the last 20 years to less than $10 million. Why would you say BWIP is no longer considered as part of the effort to focus resources on core environmental work?
Well, first of all, Congressman, thank you for the comment on San Diego on the WIFIA loan that we provided them. I think that's a good example on how we can continue to support border projects. The budget does eliminate most regional voluntary programs, but we can still address those same problems and concerns through existing programs at the agency, such as the SRF. I'm told that with the border states, Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas, there's $400 million available through water infrastructure that can go towards the border through the SRF. With the WIFIA, we can continue to look at new innovative ways of funding border initiatives with the WIFIA loan program. We did ask for $25 million more than what we requested last year for WIFIA, And then we also have the new EPA, which Congress just passed last year, where we're asking for $83 million, which we believe will really help smaller communities address water problems. So we're trying to spread our money among different programs to address water concerns.
Right, and obviously the concern we have is that the BWIP program is focused on the border. So the FRS projects the money's only going to projects in the United States. To be eligible for the BWIP funding, projects must be located within 100 kilometers or 62 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. So are you going to do something specifically to make sure that border projects have dedicated funding from the SRF?
Again, you know, we will spend the money appropriated by Congress if Congress does give us money for the program, but we're also working with the Department of State and other federal agencies to determine what else we can do on the border. And my regional administrator, Mike Stoker in California, has been down at the border numerous times and talking to our Mexican counterparts. I'll be down in Mexico for the CGC, I believe. It's the Canadian, U.S., Mexican Environmental Ministers meeting in June, and this is actually the end of May. Okay. This is a high priority for me when I
just expressed the concern. I appreciate that too, and I appreciate the administrator from Region 9 has been active and present. But as you know, this is a unique among federal funding programs because it's the only federal program that can fund projects on both sides of the border, with all projects benefiting communities on the United States side of the border. So I expressed that concern. I raised that objection, and hope to be able to provide you and your administrator with specific tools for the U.S.-Mexico border by preserving the BWIP. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the Republican leader of the full committee, the gentleman from Oregon, Representative Walden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. And to the administrator, welcome back. I know your years as a Senate staffer make you no stranger to this kind of body, and we're glad to have you over here on the People's House today. I appreciate your commitment, Mr. Administrator, this administration and its budget to 3 goals of the agency: core mission, cooperative federalism, and rule of law and process. I think that's all really important, and I appreciate your leadership on so many issues, including waters of the U.S. You know, in my district, I heard about it again when I did a series of town halls a week ago. Farmers and ranchers pretty concerned but appreciative of where you're taking that rule. And I think that gives them some certainty while protecting the environment, but not going too far. 3 weeks ago, you gave a speech about the importance of water to global public health, particularly safe drinking water, and how unsafe drinking water poses the greatest, most immediate global threat to the environment. Can you please expound upon that position, and how would you rate water quality in the good old US of A?
Our water quality, I believe, is the safest in the world. Back in the 1970s, 40% of our water systems failed to meet EPA standards. Today, 92% of our water systems meet the EPA standards every single day. But worldwide, it is a huge issue. You have 1 to 3 million people dying based on water, unsafe drinking water or water sanitation issues. The UN estimates 1,000 children die every single day from lack of potable water. I think that's a huge issue, and I think that we have the skills, we have the technology to help solve this problem worldwide.
Now, obviously, you know, Mr. Administrator, the Energy and Commerce Committee in the last Congress rewrote the Safe Drinking Water Act. We did that in a bipartisan way. We had some good, vigorous negotiations, and that became law. The President signed it. And so I'd like to ask you a bit about the longstanding priority of this committee that when it comes to safe drinking water. Congress last year increased the authorization for the Drinking Water Revolving Loan Fund. Does the administration support a robustly funded drinking water state revolving fund?
Yes, we do, and I point out that at this point in time, because money is added to the SRF every year, we loan it out, it comes back to the program. At this point in time, there's $80 billion circulating through the 2 SRFs that are currently out on projects around the country, and that is key. But we did focus on our budget request, additional money for the WIFIA program, $25 million more than we asked for last year. And then we also asked for $83 million for EPA, which Congress passed last fall, which we did not receive any funding for this year. We actually have a number of deadlines that we're unfortunately not going to be able to meet this year because of no funding for EPA, but we're asking for $83 million because I believe there's several really new, innovative programs in the new EPA legislation that will help smaller communities, rural communities with their drinking water systems. And so I think it's important to get those programs up and running as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I do too, and we'll look forward to working with you on those. Are any states having trouble with their matching fund requirements under the Act? What are you hearing from states?
Well, we certainly had issues with Puerto Rico, even prior to the hurricanes there on the SRF. At this point, I'm not aware of any states in particular with matching fund issues. We can get back to you on that, but I'm not aware of any of the states with matching fund issues.
We're just trying to see what works and what doesn't, what we need to tweak. I understand the agency continues its lean program, or its effort to assess and align its workforce for better outputs. Is your team looking at succession planning and aligning expertise with offices?
Absolutely. The lean management system, I think, has already shown a lot of success. It's shown success on our permitting side, also on enforcement side. We're getting enforcement reports out to the regulated community faster, which gets environmental improvements done faster. And I'm very concerned about succession planning at the agency. Right now, 40% of our workforce is eligible to retire over the next 5 years. We hired a new human resources director 2 months ago. I actually interviewed the person, and I'm told that that's not typical for the administrator because about 3 levels below me, but I thought it was important for me to interview the new human resources director because I didn't want to hit her with a dozen issues on her first day without having met me first.
And I appreciate that, and I just want to close with this, Mr. Chairman. In the last Congress, we had some level of difficulty getting your predecessor up here to testify on the budget. We appreciate your willingness to do so and to work with the committee on this and a whole host of other issues. So thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Representative Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, before he begins, could I correct one thing that I said? I've said twice that we had a $25 million increase in WIFIA requests. It was actually 25%. I've said that twice. I just want to correct that for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Wheeler, you can tell from my opening that I'm deeply concerned about the direction of the EPA. As I said in my opening, I had hoped that when Scott Pruitt resigned that EPA would return to its mission of protecting human health and the environment, but I think that this budget shows that protecting public health is not a priority. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to move quickly and ask you really to answer yes or no. And if you can't answer yes or no, then I'm probably just going to assume it's a no. But let me start. In 2017, Scott Pruitt committed to me in this room to expand the risk evaluation for asbestos to include exposures to legacy asbestos, but that hasn't been done. I think it's unconscionable that we're still importing and using asbestos 40 years after EPA started work on a ban, despite knowing that it's killing 40,000 people a year in this country. So my question is, will you commit to banning ongoing uses of asbestos under TSCA, yes or no?
Yes, we're doing more on asbestos than any administration in the last 25 years.
That. Let me just keep going. Last year, Scott Pruitt committed to me and to the public that he would ban methylene chloride. But now you've moved forward with only a partial ban, leaving commercial uses in place. And this chemical has killed scores of workers and needs to be banned for commercial uses as well, in my opinion. So will you commit to banning commercial uses of methylene chloride?
We're taking comment on a training and certification program for commercial users.
All right, well, so far the answer, I guess, is no. We've also heard a lot of talk from EPA on PFAS chemicals, but we haven't seen action to go along with it. All we have so far on drinking water is an intention to reach a regulatory determination on 2 PFAS chemicals by the end of the year. I don't think that's enough. So the question is, will you commit to setting a strict MCL or drinking water standard for all the PFAS impacting drinking water in this country? And will you commit to ensuring that any MCL or drinking water standard that you set actually protects public health? That should be an easy yes.
We have already started the MCL process, but we haven't slowed down. We're still enforcing cleanups around the country. We've taken 8 enforcement actions. We've assisted states in dozens of enforcement actions around the country.
It sounds like that's a no, too. I just don't see how the American people can trust you to protect their health and environment if you don't, commit to what I just asked with regard to the MCL. And to make matters worse, we've seen serious efforts during your tenure to circumvent transparency and hide important risk information from the public. So in my opinion, these efforts have gone beyond what we saw in the Pruitt administration, and are really cause for concern. Now, let me ask, on Pigment Violet 29, you've so far refused to share the scientific studies you used to exonerate a chemical many believe to be dangerous, and I had to send you 2 letters to get those studies released, and when you did release them, you still redacted the main data tables you relied on, which I thought was unacceptable. Will you commit to sharing those data tables with this committee and with the American public? Do you follow what I'm asking you?
The data that was redacted was confidential business information. As you know, under TSCA, we're required to keep CBI confidential.
So the answer is no again.
Under the law, we can't, sir.
Well, that's a question of interpretation. Oftentimes, the Trump administration says they're following the law and they don't, but whatever. On PFAS, EPA recently released a notice of violation against Chemours, I guess that's DuPont, one of the main PFAS manufacturers, for issues at 2 PFAS plants. This notice should be an important tool for the communities around these plants, but the notice and report is so heavily redacted, I think, again, it's ridiculous. My staff was able to find much of the redacted information already available to the public, but even a generic chemical identity, which exists just to inform the public while protecting CBI, was redacted. And this, again, this over-redaction, I know you said it with regard to the previous question, is, you think you're required to do it, but I think it's way beyond what the law requires, and I think it's the over-redaction really is I think offensive to the communities that are dealing with this PFAS pollution. So let me ask you on that, on this Chemours or DuPont, will you commit to sharing an unredacted version of the Chemours Notice of Violation report with this committee and the American public?
Again, we have to safeguard confidential business information as required under our statutes, but we have directed Chemours to test hundreds of water supplies within the areas around the 2 facilities, and they are doing that, and we're using our enforcement tools to make sure that it's getting done.
Well, I think, again, the answer is no, and I disagree with what you think needs to be redacted. But I think you're just not doing enough to protect public health and the environment, and I appreciate your willingness to come here today, but we need more from you in terms of transparency, responsiveness, and action to address serious threats to our health. That's just my opinion, and I want you to know that. I appreciate your coming, but we're not getting a lot of this information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from West Virginia, Representative McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome.
Thank you, sir.
My friend, over the years, the various regions of the EPA, the 10 regions, have come under a lot of criticism. Autonomously operating as they do, often each region operating with its own individuality, contrary to others. I know in West Virginia that the compliance in West Virginia is out of Philadelphia can be entirely different than 1,000 feet across the river in Ohio. It comes out of Chicago. And I saw that last week you were putting out a reorganization on that. Long overdue. GAO came out with something back in 2006, called for some reorganization. I know that the Senator Inhofe back in 2006 also called for that. So I'm curious to see a little bit. Thank you for, hopefully you're going to address it thoroughly. But there are a couple of things with it. What's your objective? And secondly, what are going to be the metrics that we can measure that we have now finally gotten control over the 10 agencies or 10 entities?
Certainly. Thank you, Senator. First of all, our administration, when we were selected our regional administrators for the regions, we wanted to make sure that we selected people that had state experience. And I think that's helped us a lot in the regional management of all 10 regions, having 10 regional administrators with former state experience. But what our regional reorganization, and it takes effect on Monday the 15th, we are realigning the regional offices to mirror the headquarters. Probably the biggest change, 6 of the regions had enforcement divisions. 4 of the regions did not have enforcement divisions. They sprinkled their enforcement people throughout each of the program offices. 1 region didn't even have an air division in the title. So people had a problem trying to figure out who to go to from region if you needed a permit or if you needed help on a particular issue. So what we did was realigned all the regions to mirror the headquarters, and it's going to allow, for example, the enforcement office at EPA headquarters to work more closely with the enforcement divisions around the country to make sure there's continuity and to make sure that there is consistency between the regions. And we'll do that as well in the program office.
I think the consistency is long overdue, so thank you for doing that. Two quick questions back to the state revolving fund. I know you said that there's $80 billion now floating through the system, but the optics of cutting $300 million out this year is hard to promote. Can you explain that a little bit better about how cutting $300 million out of an appropriation for the state revolving fund actually is going to help?
Well, we are asking
more sewer and water lines built around the country.
We are asking for close to $2 billion in our budget request. It's not as high as what Congress appropriated for this year, but we're also asking for an increase in the WIFIA program from what we requested last year.
The SRF you're cutting the SRF $300 million or so. I'm hung up on the optics.
I understand.
Because my issue, every time I go to a county commission or whether they're asking for more money, finding they need to have water and the infrastructure, and I'm having a hard time to explain, but there's $80 billion flowing through the system, they're not getting it.
But at this point in time, we believe the WIFIA program offers some more innovative ways of funding some of these water projects, and we're very encouraged by the legislation and the EPA legislation from last year. So we're asking for more money for those two programs because we want to see if there's a different way of trying to solve the water problems for communities around the country.
Thank you, Minister. Maybe we need to have more of a conversation later about this. The third and last question has to do with a small refinery in West Virginia. It's the only refinery we have. It's Argonne, 25,000 gallons a day. Trying to compete with Marathon, that's 3 million gallons a day of preparation. But under the DOE and the EPA rate, you're treating them all the same. I'm troubled with that, and I'm hoping that you will look at that dealing with the RINs, how we might be able to take care of that. DOE has made some kind of recommendation to you, but it's up to you now with the EPA to make a determination of whether or not a 25,000 gallon boutique refinery should meet the same standards as a 3 million gallon refinery. Do you have a comment about that?
That is a very unique refinery. They specialize in lube oil instead of gasoline.
Yes.
As we've discussed before. I'm happy to work with you in your office more on that, but it presents some different challenges as far as the small refinery exemption.
Let's find a solution to those challenges, okay? Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Delaware, Representative Lisa Blunt, Rochester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, thank you for joining our committee today to talk about your agency's budget and its priorities under your leadership. I do have to start by echoing the sentiments of my colleagues. I have a great deal of concern about your proposal to cut your agency and your staff by nearly a third. At your Senate confirmation hearing earlier this year, you testified that President Trump and the EPA are, quote, focused on putting Americans first, end quote. You specifically cited the administration's commitment to expanding access to safe drinking water and protecting Americans living near hazardous sites from health risks. Mr. Wheeler, I'd like to just start off with a few simple one-word yes or no questions. First, do you stand by that commitment?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Second, thank you. Do you believe that the agency's actions under your leadership, along with this budget proposal, reflect that commitment?
Yes.
And Mr. Secretary, is it true that your FY20 budget proposes to eliminate the Safe Water for Small and Disadvantaged Communities program?
Yes, I believe so.
Isn't it true that the purpose of that program is to support drinking water projects and activities in small and disadvantaged communities that are unable to finance projects to comply with drinking water regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act?
Yes, but we're looking to use the EPA legislation that Congress passed last year to work with those same communities. We think the flexibilities in EPA might be better use of the dollars.
So I'm going to ask you a question, because it's my understanding that this money had already been appropriated before. Can you give me the rationale? Is there a study or something that shows why you made this decision?
We're moving forward with the money that was appropriated, but as far as for next year, 2020, we believe funding the AWEA program, which will target the same communities, might be a more innovative way of using the funding from Congress.
Has the program even been established? I mean, it was appropriated, it's my understanding, before this year, before you even came on board. I was aware that $45 million had been appropriated for this program, correct?
And we are moving forward with the money that has been appropriated. But for 2020,
but you're
we're suggesting the money should go to AWEA, under the $83 million to AWEA, to address some of the same communities.
So again, I just want to be clear, does that mean it's not going to be specifically targeted towards small and disadvantaged communities? Just so I can have that on the record.
Program, but there's other ways of targeting small disadvantaged communities through the AWEA program.
So we do have a commitment that at least $45 million will be targeted to small and disadvantaged communities.
I don't know the dollar amount. It depends on what the appropriations that we do receive for AWEA, but the program that you're asking about, that money will be going out this year.
Okay, so first of all, my concern is that there was a program, the money wasn't appropriated, now we're kind of putting it all together. I just want to share with you, in Delaware, we have a small town called Ellendale, and it's a community that has struggled to have clean, safe drinking water. They've had elevated levels of bacteria, nitrates, and iron in the water. And fortunately, they've had residents like Mr. Harold Truxon and Ms. Dolores Price who've determined and worked hard to make sure that they passed a referendum after 2 failed ones, after 35 years of trying to get safe drinking water. 400 people in this small community, 20% poverty level. And to me, budgets and calendars reflect priorities. I'm concerned that in addition to this, there's also the elimination of the Small Minority Business Assistance Program. And so if we have priorities, our budget should reflect that. What I would love to hear is a commitment that small, rural, and disadvantaged communities that need the support and leadership can count on that kind of support and commitment, and that we can see these dollars that were targeted for those areas actually go to those areas. Do I have that commitment?
Yes, and the money for the assistance for small disadvantaged communities, the $45 million, will be going out this summer. And again, we believe under AWEA next year, we can target those same communities.
Thank you. I yield back.
Januletti yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the state of Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Wheeler, thank you again for joining us today. A few years ago, I helped to get language added to Section 8 of the Toxic Substances Control Act to create a negotiated rulemaking between EPA and regulated stakeholders to reduce duplicate reporting of unintended byproducts. Unfortunately, the legal and procedural venues were not conducive to producing a satisfactory result. I understand that the agency is close to proposing a rulemaking under TSCA Section 8. Will that rulemaking make any effort to address duplicate reporting to the agency?
I believe it will, but I'll have to get back with you on the details.
Okay, yeah, could you please? I appreciate that. Thank you. In the last Congress, this subcommittee examined Clean Air Act provisions that could be updated to reflect what we have learned over 30 years, such as the NSR program. We heard witnesses express concern that innovative technologies and systems to improve facilities are being left on the shelf, unfortunately, because of current NSR processes. We learned how the NSR program can make things like incremental pollution control improvements, carrying out energy efficiency upgrades, and keeping facilities in good working order for safety and reliability purposes very, very challenging. I believe we also learned that we can accomplish most or all of the anticipated environmental benefits of the NSR at considerably reduced costs with creative reforms to this program. So Administrator Wheeler, can you speak broadly about why updating the NSR program would be beneficial and what you're going to do or what you're doing to explore administrative changes to the program?
Absolutely. First, to answer your second part, we have a number of guidance documents that we've issued over the last year and a half from the Air Office on new source review, including the once in, always in guidance, and we are now working to put those into regulatory text and go out for public comment. Previously, NSR regularly discouraged companies from investing in and deploying the cleanest and most efficient technologies. Through our NSR reforms, we're providing clarity to permitting requirements, improving the overall process. We're also incentivizing investments in the latest energy technologies. So we're trying to modernize the NSR program to make sure that it's not a deterrent to pollution prevention going forward.
Okay. Would reforms that make it easier to make decisions to upgrade equipment that led to reduced greenhouse gas emissions help our nation's climate policies, do you think?
Yes, it would.
Okay. What is the status of your proposed rulemaking to replace the Clean Power Plan, and how does that proposal address new source review?
We do have in the proposal, we had a section on new source review to allow companies to install the latest energy efficient equipment at their facilities and without having to trigger NSR, which will get reductions faster. We are looking at whether or not to include that in the final regulation or to separate that out as a separate NSR regulation, but in either event, we'll either move forward with it together or separate, but we will move forward with both pieces. The ACE proposal, once it's fully implemented, will reduce CO2 emissions from the electric power sector by 34%, which will go a long ways to meeting our CO2 goals for the country.
Okay. Are there other initiatives you could pursue this year to provide greater certainty to facilities and will make the steps to upgrade without fear of triggering NSR?
Yes, we have several, as I mentioned, we have several NSR regulatory rulemakings in the process. We have additional guidance documents that will be going out, but we're trying to modernize the NSR program, which has kind of been stuck in 20 years and is not allowed for innovation for new pollution prevention control technologies.
Okay. I've got about 33 seconds left. Recently, the agency released a multi-pronged PFAS action plan. There are 4,000 PFAS chemicals, and yet only 18 can be detected in water, and health effects are known about 0.5% of the substances. Can you talk just real briefly about the importance of getting the work right to understand how best to approach PFAS issues moving forward?
Absolutely. There are thousands of different PFAS chemicals. We have some of the best researchers in the world working on this in our research labs. The same control technologies can't be used for different PFAS chemicals. It doesn't. For some of the long chain compounds, the control technologies don't necessarily work for the short chain. Also, the detections are different.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida. Representative Soto for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Wheeler, is climate change real?
Yes.
And is it caused by human activity?
Human activity certainly is a causing factor of climate change, yes.
And is fossil fuels and other carbon emissions part of that human activity causing climate change?
Yes.
And there was a recent NOAA report, the Federal Climate Assessment, on November 23rd, 2018. Do you agree with the assessment of what could happen based upon climate change in that NOAA report?
Well, the assessment, at least in the press, focused more on the worst-case scenario, which is the 8.5, RCP 8.5, which that worst-case scenario is actually no longer being used by the UN's IPCC. So I think the news reports, at least, of the assessment are slightly misleading. But the underlying science, I've been briefed by my staff a few times on it. I read the assessment when it came out. And we're moving forward. As I mentioned a minute ago, our ACE proposal is going to reduce CO2. Our CAFE standards will also reduce CO2. So we are moving forward with the authorities that Congress has given us under the Clean Air Act to address CO2.
Thank you. And we had some op-eds in my local district where local constituents of mine were concerned about stacking science advisory groups with industry folks and a reduction in monitoring and enforcement. Can you give us an idea of the number of cases brought in 2016 versus 17 and 18, and what you're looking like this year as far as cases brought?
Well, the cases do vary from year to year, particularly on the fines. This year is going to be particularly large with the recent Fiat Chrysler enforcement action that we took in January. Our criminal cases last year was an uptick, the first time we had an increase in criminal cases since 2011. We also have an increase on the audit side. So we're trying to prevent the pollution from happening through the audits. But if it does happen, we're making sure that people realize we're going to be taking criminal cases if we need to make sure that people are complying with the law.
So there's been an uptick in criminal and audits, but a downtick overall with civil cases. Is that fair to say?
There was a slight downtick, I believe, in civil cases last year. One of the things that we've been criticized is a downtick in the number of inspections. But as we delegate more programs to the states have the primacy there, and they conduct the majority of the inspections. And we're providing technical assistance through our criminal lab in Colorado to a number of states around the country to help them with their inspections to make sure that they're done properly.
Thank you, Administrator Wheeler. And, I come from the state of Florida. We have a big issue with red tide and toxic algae blooms. We've had researchers say that the warmer weather may now be a key determinant of algae blooms in Lake Okeechobee, and scientists have found that over the last 25 years, Lake Okeechobee has continuously warmed, and according to NOAA, the quote, harmful algae blooms in general expected to increase in a warming world thanks to warming sea surface temperatures, end quote. And then the director of Florida Sea Grant at the University of Florida said, I quote, at this time, it is not clear if the ecosystem services provided by Lake Okeechobee can be protected if climate change in the future decades includes both increased temperatures and less rainfall. Do you agree with those scientific assessments?
I'd have to look at those assessments specifically. I'd rather not give a general agreement without having read the actual assessments.
Does the EPA generally agree that warming seas could exacerbate algae blooms?
Yes, that's one of the factors exacerbating algae blooms. Also, nutrients are as well, and we're working on that through a number of innovative ways. We just released a new market-based mechanism program in February to try to help farmers on nutrient loading.
And would a reduction in emissions help combat climate change and potentially fix this potential damage in the future?
If you're referring to reductions in CO2,
yes.
Yes, but it's on the margins. I think adaptation is very important, and why it's important, the President was down at Lake Okeechobee last week or the week before and committed to fully funding the program there for the dike. I think that's very important. We're working on the other side with the nutrient loading, and we have some of the best researchers in the world on the algae blooms on a number of our research facilities, including RTP in North Carolina, which is doing some groundbreaking research on how to better protect.
Thank you, Administrator Wheeler, and we appreciate the President being there. We were concerned about the budget cuts, but obviously we'll be working on those. Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce a letter to the record from nearly a dozen public health groups declaring that climate change is in fact a health emergency for both algae blooms and Lake Okeechobee.
At the end of the hearing, we'll take up all the offers for submission to the record, but we're pleased to do that. The gentleman yields back, and now Chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Representative Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Wheeler, 362 days ago, the President issued a memo to EPA directing the Administrator to take specific actions to ensure more efficient and cost-effective implementation of the agency's National Air Quality Standards Program. The President requested more timely processing of state implementation plans. Can you give us an update and report card on yourself on that?
Yes, we are moving forward to conduct the 5-year review for both PM and ozone and conduct them both on time. That'd be the first time the agency's ever completed that. We've taken a number of steps to shorten the review period. The Clean Air Act directs us to review it every 5 years, and we're on schedule to get it done within the 5-year period, which is the end of 2020.
Okay. The President also requested engagement with states on regional haze plans, How are you doing on that? Can you give us an update?
I think we're doing very well on that. You know, the previous administration issued a record number of federal implementation plans, most of them around the Regional Haze program. In fact, they issued more FIPs than the previous 4 administrations combined. What we have done since March of 2017 is on average turn 1 FIP into a SIP each month and turn it into a federal implementation plan to a state implementations plan. So we're working much closer with the states to make sure that they're moving forward, but we're working cooperatively and collaboratively with the states.
The President in that memo also requested more timely processing of pre-construction permit applications, which has been a big issue. How are you doing there?
I think we're moving forward on that very well, and again, working closely with the states.
Okay. In the past 2 Congresses, have been trying to enact reforms to air quality standards that help prevent areas from being unfairly penalized for emissions beyond their control. I'm reminded of a hearing we had in here in the last Congress, and we had several folks in from California, and they said that their cities, they were concerned if you took every motorcycle, every big truck, every car, everything off, every train, everything off the highways and rails of California, they could still not comply with the ozone standards. So the President asked in his memo that you respond more quickly to states' petitions for relief under exceptional events and international emissions provisions of the Clean Air Act. What are you doing to implement this directive?
We are working more closely with the states. I think I mentioned in my opening statement that we moved Cleveland from non-attainment to attainment last week for particulate matter. We have another one that we're announcing this week. I don't believe it's public yet, where we're going from non-attainment to attainment. We're trying to work with those communities and also working with them on the exceptional events and things outside their control, such as forest fires or emissions from China. We know a lot more on modeling on where the emissions are coming from, and a lot of the emissions that are impacting western states, Colorado, for example, is coming from overseas.
And that continues to be a huge issue, because if you've ever traveled to Beijing or several places in China, you can't see across the street. And the President's memo also directed you to fully implement the Clean Air Act, providing that require the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee to advise you on the adverse health or other effects that may result from implementation of revised air quality standards. In previous administrations, the legal requirement to look at other adverse impacts, including welfare, social, economic, and energy effects, was ignored by the EPA. Have you provided direction or a charge to the Scientific Advisory Committee to provide you with advice about other adverse impacts that may result from efforts to meet air quality standards?
I have. We've asked them to provide advice on all the issues you just named.
And that's going fairly well?
Yes.
Okay. Will you provide for the record an update on each item in the President's memo, again, 362 days ago when it came out, and how EPA is addressing those directives?
Yes, happy to, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of California, Representative Barragan, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Wheeler, I want to ask you about the drinking water infrastructure portion of the budget. My understanding is that EPA is requesting approximately $300 million less than the FY 2019 amounts were enacted. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Have you ever gone to a community and been served brown water to drink?
Brown water to drink?
Yeah.
Yes, probably in parts of, no offense, sir, but probably parts of West Virginia over the years.
And have you drank that brown water?
No.
Is there a reason why you haven't drank that brown water?
Wasn't sure of the safety of it. As I said in my opening statement, though, 92% of the water systems in the country today meet EPA standards every single day.
Well, do you know that brown water in some communities are deemed to be safe, yet it's still brown, yet children get they're straight out concerned about the brown water. They're afraid of the water. They don't want to drink the water. It tastes bad. Have you heard of these reports before?
Not specifically, but when we hear of those reports, we work with the communities to make sure that the water is in fact safe.
Well, let me tell you,
States and local communities to test the water.
I appreciate that.
Everyone, regardless of their zip code, deserves safe drinking water.
I want to share with you what happened in my congressional district. In Compton, California, the water was coming out brown from the faucets. It was tested, and my constituents were told that the water was okay to drink, that it was completely safe. And I can guarantee you that none of the elected officials in my district wanted to drink that water. And Mr. Wheeler, if you were served that water, you wouldn't want to drink it either. This is where there is a huge disparity in environmental justice. And black and brown communities in particular, and low-income communities across the country, are being told it's okay that they have to drink brown water, even though it tastes terrible, and even though children are afraid of it, and even though when they bathe with this water, they develop rash, and they have other health impacts like an upset stomach. And it's completely unacceptable that anybody would have to drink brown water. And so I invite you to go to some of those communities to see the water. If you think it's safe, like it's tested, drink it. Show the community that if it's good enough for them, it should be good enough for you as well. And I see this cut by $300 million, and it concerns me. And this is exactly why we're not having infrastructure projects for safe drinking water and what I would call clean water for our constituents. And so I would ask you to visit these communities, and I would invite you to some of them. I want to move on to another topic. My district also includes the Port of Los Angeles. Now, it's one of the busiest shipping facilities in the country. Heavy-duty trains and trucks carry cargo back and forth between the port and major rail yards. Diesel exhaust from rail traffic is a significant source of air pollution, including particulate matter. Diesel exhaust is linked to higher deaths and higher incidences of asthma, cancer, stroke, heart attack, and premature deaths. My constituents have to breathe this polluted air. These are low-income communities of color that live, work, and go to school near the port and the rail corridors. They disproportionately bear the burden of this pollution. What are you doing to help these communities by reducing air pollution from locomotives and other rail facilities?
Well, we're working with the state of California. When I was in private practice, I actually represented the South Coast Air Quality Management District, so I'm very familiar with the issues around the port. We're working through our Region 9 office out of San Francisco to help reduce the pollution in those areas. We have a number of grant programs that help areas like that. And we also, in addition to the locomotive issue, we also have the heavy-duty diesel truck issue as well. And we announced this year that we're going to reduce NOx from the heavy-duty trucks.
I want to focus on rails, sir. I appreciate you wanting me to talk about the truck program, but could you maybe tell me on the rail program what you all are doing?
I will have to get back to you specifics on the rail program. I don't want to give you wrong data.
Well, will you commit to bringing EPA's regulatory power and ability to drive market incentives to bear to move the rail industry toward zero-emissions technologies?
We are working with the rail industry, and we're trying to reduce the pollution across the board.
So you won't commit. Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the state of Texas, Representative Flores, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Leader Shimkus, for today's meeting. Administrator Wheeler, thank you for being here. I'd like to comment before I get into my questions about a quote from Chairman Pallone a few minutes ago. It says that a budget is an expression of priorities. I'd like to remind everyone in the audience today that the Democratic House majority has recently said that they don't intend to put forward a budget, so I think the American people are rightly curious about what the Democratic House priorities are. Administrator Wheeler, in response to the design flaws of the RFS the way it is today, the statutory design flaws, as well as the pending expiration of the RFS in 2022, Leader Shimkus and I put together a proposed piece of legislation that was based on input from the brightest minds and engineers, not only in the vehicle space, but also in the renewable fuel space, the refining community, those that in the retail community for vehicle fuels. And it was done so that it proposed a high octane standard so that we could get the most desirable level of efficiency and emissions in one solution. Do you have views on the effectiveness of that approach of having an integrated solution for fuels and vehicles in one piece of statutory legislation?
Well, as far as a nationwide octane standard, we don't believe we have the authority to create one absent congressional authorization.
That was actually my next question. So
I'm doing them in reverse.
Okay, so you're saying the EPA doesn't have the authority. What do you think about that type of solution in terms of having a statutory solution in order to address emissions and efficiency to combined vehicle design and fuel performance specifications?
I can't at this point give you specific administration approval or acceptance or acquiescence on congressional legislation without going through the OMB process. In general terms, I do think we need to be creative in how we look at the next generation of the RFS post-2022, and I think everything should be on the table. And I think the program does need to have need to be modernized with the way that we've seen the data develop over the last 10 years.
Okay, that's what Mr. Shimkus and I were attempting to do, is to be creative and to think outside the box. But we did it with having the brightest minds and engineers working on this from all parts of the space, including the environmental community. I want to follow up on Mr. Shimkus' questions regarding vehicles and fuels. Some folks in Washington would like to see a heavy reliance on electrical vehicles in the future. I think that makes some sense. However, there's some issues that we need to be concerned about in doing that, particularly the environmental impact of lithium batteries. Is the EPA studying the impact of a much higher use of electric vehicles in terms of environmental impact of lithium batteries?
I'm not aware of studying specifically the use of the greater use of lithium batteries. We're not approaching the automotive industry as social engineering, as I believe the previous administration did. The Obama CAFE standards would have required 30% electric vehicles in order to comply with the standards by 2025. We're looking at what the American public is buying and trying to set standards regardless of the type of automobile. So we're not doing social engineering, but there are certainly environmental issues around all choices, including electric vehicles and lithium batteries. But every form of energy has environmental trade-offs, and it's oftentimes those are not recognized by proponents of one form of energy over another.
Well, I appreciate your comments. I would encourage the EPA to keep an eye on that. As electric vehicles become into more common usage, there is going to be an environmental impact from lithium batteries, so I'd encourage you to keep that in mind. I'm going to run out of time before you get a chance to answer this question, so I'm going to ask you if you'd supplementally respond. In terms of the RVO reset that you're working on today, I'd like to know if the EPA is looking at any sort of EV RINs, if they're looking at the impact of higher ethanol on RIN prices and gas prices, the impact on legacy vehicles, and the impact on storage facilities and retail pumps. So if you'd supplementally respond, that'd be great.
Happy to submit that for the record.
And the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Colorado, Representative Dingell.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Wheeler, I just want to make one point with respect to the statement you made about the pollution in Colorado, the air pollution coming from Asia. And you're right, some of that seems to be coming from other places, but our former colleague and now Governor Jared Polis has announced that he's not going to seek an exemption for that, because irrespective of the source, the fact is that the air pollution is still harming Coloradoans, and so we need to do everything we can, and not just in Colorado, but around the country. We need to help work with these other countries to minimize their sources, but we also need to work on it here because it makes our people sick, no matter where it comes from. I want to follow up on some of the questions that my colleague was asking about environmental justice, because I represent an urban area, as you know. Are you familiar with the EPA's EJ 2020 Action Agenda, which is on the EPA's website?
Yes, I am.
And has the current administration adopted this, this action agenda?
I have to get back to you on the specifics.
You don't know whether you have adopted it?
We elevated environmental justice to the administrator's office to give
Right.
greater emphasis on environmental justice, and to go back to a comment.
So the action agenda is on your website right now.
Yes.
So
I believe we're
if you
implementing
get
all
back
of it.
to me and let me know if you
Absolutely.
support it. One of the things that the action agenda has done is it asks the EPA to identify, quote, 100 of the most overburdened communities where data indicate that facilities present a high likelihood of serious noncompliance issues impacting those communities and address serious violations if found. Are you familiar with that provision?
Not specifically that provision. That's why
do you know if the EPA has identified the 100 most overburdened communities?
We are in a process of identifying communities around the country that are under the new economic development processors. I think there's overlap between that list.
Okay,
and the
so
EPA
when
list.
do you think you'll have that done?
I'm not sure. I have to get back to you on that.
1 month, 6 months, a year?
I would have to get back to you on that.
Well, I appreciate if you would get back to me, because we do have some communities in my districts, Swansea, Elyria, and Globeville, that warrant specific attention and have for years. So this is of great urgency. It sounds like the administration realizes this is of great urgency. Is that right?
Yes, and my first week on the job as a deputy administrator, I sat down with our environmental justice office to
Right.
talk to them about what they're working on.
Well, that's wonderful, but we need to know which communities you're targeting.
All right.
Thank you. Now, actually, the fact that you keep saying you're going to get back to me leads me to another set of issues that I have. You probably know I'm the chair of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee of this committee. And one of the things that we're looking at in my committee is what the EPA is doing, which could undermine actions against mercury, which is a toxic chemical emitted from coal-fired plants, which can lead to brain and nervous system damage in young children. So do you know how many electric generating facilities nationwide have installed pollution controls to limit mercury emissions under the current mercury rule?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but that rule has been fully implemented at this point.
Does the EPA...
We're not rolling back anything on the mercury.
Okay, does the EPA have the number?
Yes, I'm sure we have the number. I don't have the number.
Can you get that
off the top
number
of my
to me?
head. But that regulation has been fully implemented,
Okay.
and we're not rolling that back.
Okay, great. Do you have the number?
I will get you the number.
Thank
I don't have
you.
the number on the top of my
And
head.
do you know how many facilities requested an extension for complying with federal mercury standards?
I believe all the facilities are currently in compliance with that standard.
Okay, so you're not aware of any that have requested an extension?
Off the top of my head, no, I'm not.
Okay. Now, so I and other members of the committee sent your agency several requests for documents specifically relating to the last two questions I asked you, and we have not gotten any documents back. And so I'm glad that you're saying you're going to get me information today. I'm glad you're saying you're willing to work with the committee, but we have not gotten these documents. So I just want to ask you, do I have a commitment from you that we're going to get responsive documents to the requests that we're making?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. We've received 7 letters from this committee. We've provided substantive responses to 6 of those letters, and the 7th one should be with you all in the next few days.
Okay, well,
we've provided over 4,000 pages of documents to this committee already this year.
We have a whole bunch of pages of documents.
Yes.
A lot of them have a lot of redactions, sir, but they don't relate to the specific requests that we're making. So I would just ask you if you can go back and work with your staff to look at the specific requests that we're making and try to be responsive to those.
The gentlelady yields back.
Thank you very much.
And the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Representative Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Administrator Wheeler, for coming here today. I have several questions about the proposed rollback of fuel economy and air pollution standards for our light-duty trucks and cars. Now, this proposed action is a perfect example of how EPA prioritizes boosting industries like oil industry over public health and safety. Last year, EPA announced a proposal to replace the Obama-era standards with a watered-down rule that will result in increased air pollution and less efficient cars on our roads, harming Americans' public health, American jobs, and the economy. As you know, California is uniquely situated. It has some of the worst air quality in the country. It also has a unique authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate pollution from cars, to try to meet federal clean air standards and improve public health. Let me ask you first, have you completed the rulemaking? Is a final rule ready for publication?
It's not been completed yet, no.
Okay, then why did you tell the Washington Examiner last month that you have already decided to revoke California's waiver?
At this point, we are moving forward to revoke the waiver, yes, but the rulemaking is not completed.
Okay, you said, and I quote, to have a 50-state solution, we have to take care of the waiver, end quote. Putting aside for the moment that this is wrong, are you not bound by administrative law to consider all evidence and comments submitted before making a final decision?
We are, and we're working through all those comments, yes.
Okay, I'd like to also discuss the fact that you publicly announced that you would not further negotiate with California. In the same interview with the Washington Examiner, you said EPA made a proposal to California. What exactly did you propose?
Well, that was our proposal that we released last summer, was our CAFE proposal. And I was told, I met with Mary Nichols 3 times. She said that she would get us a counter within 1 to 2 weeks. We waited over 3 months.
My understanding is that
we got a response from
the
California.
back and forth was really not a back and forth at all. I mean, it was nothing that was different than was proposed earlier.
That was our proposal, Congressman.
Well, it didn't go anywhere.
We never got a real counter proposal.
It was the same proposal that you kept moving forward, and you weren't listening to our proposal. Now, Administrator Wheeler, if you actually engaged in good faith negotiations with California automakers, with automobile manufacturers, you could achieve a 50-state solution through a negotiated agreement. And the fact is, even though you dispute this, you really never tried. I want to turn attention to the climate crisis. Last week at the DC Auto Show, when asked about the carbon impacts of your SAFE proposal, you said that your proposed rule, as compared to the Obama standards, gets about the same amount of CO2 benefit. In fact, your staff gave a presentation in September 2018 to the Clean Air Act Advisory Committee that explained that your proposal would increase carbon pollution by 3.8 billion tons through 2050. And the draft environmental impact statement for the proposed rule concluded that your recommended standards would increase carbon pollution by over 7 billion tons throughout the end of the century. That's more than the total annual carbon pollution across the entire United States. Administrator Wheeler, either you're wrong or your staff and the draft environmental impact statement are wrong. What do you think it is?
I've been told by my staff that the CO2 reductions, the impact of the CO2 reductions are pretty similar to what the Obama administration would have received would have gotten under their proposal.
Well, that's not exactly what
the Obama proposal had a number of exemptions and off-ramps, and the automobile manufacturers aren't complying with the Obama standards today.
Well,
only 3 companies today are able to comply with
I still believe
this
that
year's
this is not
standards.
It sounds awfully confusing to me. Sounds awfully confusing to me. Another issue that we'd like to bring up is that there's no dispute that EPA used the Omega model in the rulemaking process to roll back fuel economy standards. EPA has refused to release the model. Will you commit to releasing the latest version of the model, yes or no? We
did not use the Omega model for the proposal. We We've been working with the Omega model. The last version of the Omega model that was finished in 2016 was released publicly, but we do not release models while we're in the middle of a rulemaking process. No.
Not at all. We'd like to have a little more transparency
Not during a
here.
rulemaking process.
Okay, now you may pretend that climate change is not an imminent threat, but Americans across this country are reeling from natural disasters that climate change is exacerbating, and it's only getting worse. We urgently need to reduce carbon pollution, not recklessly boost it. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative McNerney, for 5 minutes, please.
I thank the chairman, and I thank you, Mr. Administrator, for testifying this morning.
Thank you.
My district, California's 9th, is located at the northern end of the San Joaquin Valley. It's home to one of the nation's worst air quality, which routinely fails to meet the federal standards for ozone and particulate pollution. That's why I was disheartened but not surprised by the budget request. Part of your agency's mission is to protect the quality, the air quality, yet your fiscal year 20 budget proposes a 46% cut in funding for that purpose. Notably, the proposed cuts in categorical grants include a 35% cut in funding for air and radiation, primarily to support state, local, and tribal air quality management programs. So, how can the EPA tout principles of cooperative federalism and simultaneously undermine these principles by not providing nearly enough resources for states to conduct their own air quality programs?
We believe the resources we've requested through the budget will allow us to return the agency to its core mission of protecting public health and the environment, and we have a number of different tools where we can help the states and local governments meet the standards.
I think you'll find there's pretty universal disagreement with that assessment, Administrator. PFAS are also a pressing concern in my district and nationwide. I had good hopes for your PFAS action plan, but now we see that it fails to address these exposures and the concerns of the American public. The plan does not deliver drinking water standards, Superfund cleanup requirements, waste limits, water discharge limits, air emission limits, or even report on releases. We need real action to address PFAS in our drinking water, our soil, and our air. I want to focus, though, on air releases because I don't think they've gotten the attention they need. I was pleased when David Ross, your Assistant Administrator for the Office of Water, recently told Congress that the agency was investing in stack emissions research related to PFAS. But I don't see that or other key emission testing research in your budget. Will you commit, Mr. Wheeler, to fully funding the Office of Research and Development, air emissions testing, and methods for development of PFAS? Will you make that commitment?
We have not cut the research for PFAS, PFOA. We have a lot of research going on in a number of our labs around the country. It is a high priority, and we are moving forward with a lot of research. We're looking at both identifying the chemicals, trying to identify the human consequences from the different versions of the PFAS, PFOA. There's several thousand different chemicals in this family of chemicals, and we're looking at the different cleanup technologies. So we are doing groundbreaking research by our EPA career employees at a number of our facilities, looking at the entire life cycle of the PFAS, PFOA.
Well, okay, that sounds good, but evidence is coming in showing that air emissions of PFAS end up in our water, so we can't ignore this pollution source either. Emerging contaminants such as PFAS demand more investment in science, not the kind of cuts that we're seeing in your proposed budget. Linda Birnbaum, the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, recently testified that the Institute's research on toxicity of PFAS chemicals. It's essential that EPA make use of this research in doing what it does to address PFAS. Will you commit to using the research of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has done on PFAS chemicals and ensuring that the regulatory actions you take on PFAS are consistent to address the hazards that the agency has identified?
Absolutely. We're working with all of our federal partners on this. And as I said earlier, this is the most comprehensive multimedia action plan this agency has ever developed for emerging chemical of concern like this.
Well, when you use words like ever, this ever developed, and you propose huge cuts, 35, 40% cuts, how can that be consistent?
We have not cut our research on PFAS, PFOA, and we're moving forward on a number of different regulatory fronts. Plus, we are already enforcing our 70 parts per trillion standard, or at 8 different sites around the country, and we've assisted states in over 24 enforcement actions around the country as well. So we're moving forward to clean it up where we find it. We're using groundbreaking GIS modeling to determine where the problems are.
I mean, we'll have to see if that's consistent with what your testimony says. Pat Bicey, the director of the Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry, also recently testified to the important work his agency is doing to identify hazards from PFAS. Will you commit to ensuring that all regulatory actions you take on PFAS are sufficient to address the hazards that that agency has identified?
Yes, their number is very different than ours. But yes, we're working closely with ATSDR on this.
All right, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Dingell, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to find peace. Mr. Wheeler, the issue of fuel economy standards is one that's very complex, and I know you're well-versed in its history and its intricacies, just like I am. But I'm at a loss, and I'm not trying to be hostile. I care about the auto industry. It's still the backbone of the American economy. And I'm at a loss when it comes to reaching a consensus between everyone. I know there was a meeting in the Oval Office. I know the President asked EPA and NHTSA to work with all the stakeholders and try to come up with one standard. And it matters. This is an industry that is far more fragile. You probably do understand how fragile it is than many people realize. And even as we were having a discussion, I keep saying to my colleagues here, when those Obama standards were set, there was an assumption that there would be 30% electric vehicles. And we've got a lot of problems. And it doesn't help when the president takes shots at EVs. EVs need to be part of that equation. And we're competing in a global marketplace where you've got countries, and I think we want to be competitive in the global marketplace. China's telling everybody they got to go to those EVs. So can you, and I called Mary Nichols myself right before she left, I think she's just about back, and said, am I going on a Don Quixote mission? Or are you willing to go to the table and sit down? Everybody needs this. Everybody wants it. The environmentalists, the autos. You say you're working, Mary's willing to go back to the table. Can we go to the table and get one national standard that'll keep a strong, competitive auto industry?
I would love to have a one standard 50-state solution to this. You know, when Mary Nichols gave us her counter proposal after 3 months, she said at the time that, you know, although she was the director of the California Air Resources Board, that the board members had not signed off on it. She said that the incoming governor had not signed off on it, the outgoing governor had not signed off on it, and the attorney general who threatened to sue us at the time had not signed off on it, and he's already sued us. There's a lot of politics going on in California over this issue. I would love to have a 50-state solution on this.
So I understand those politics, but I also understand, you know, I'm not old, but I am seasoned, and I know how tough these issues are. And if we can get everybody back at that table, we need to do it. This industry cannot afford to have two separate standards. We want to stay at the forefront of innovation and technology. That means money needs to be going into R&D, not a court battle that's going to go forever, that's going to give this industry uncertainty. So could I get a commitment from you? Can we try to go back to that table? Mary should be back right about now. Can we do that?
We're always open to hearing from California on this, but to be frank, they did not come forward with a credible offer last fall. We were asking them for weeks, what is it that you want? And I think it's important to note that when we're talking about the California waiver, we're not talking about the health-based standards. We're only talking about the energy efficiency standard.
Well, you know, I mean, for the environmental advocates and the auto industry are okay with the continuation of the California waiver. Who do you think we're helping by taking it away?
If we end up having two different standards for the entire country, it's going to create problems across the board. Chaos, it will. In our proposal, California only looked at energy efficiency. Our proposal looks at energy efficiency as well as public safety. And under our proposal, we estimate 15,000 lives saved. California is only looking at this with one goal in mind, and that's energy efficiency and CO2. We're looking at it much broader than that, including public safety, and using real data as far as what American consumers are purchasing today.
So I want to continue this, and I'm committed because this industry and this economy and this country depends on this. So having said that, I need to ask you one other question because I got 49 seconds left. We've had an EPA lab that started out in 1920 as part of the military, then it went to the public health department, and then it's been yours since its EPA was founded. It's on Grosse Ile. It's critical for many things in Michigan, the Great Lakes. A couple of years ago, you threatened to close the Ann Arbor lab. Administrator kept that open, and environmentalists, auto industry, everybody said that was critical. Can you take another look at not closing this Grosse Ile EPA office, which I have people in my office every day telling me how critical it is to the Great Lakes, emergency cleanups, et cetera? I know you were ready for that question.
I certainly take another look at it, but we are trying to consolidate. The Ann Arbor facility is very important. I've been to Ann Arbor twice now to visit that facility. It is very important. It is important. But we have facilities in almost every state, I think 40 states, and we need to be reducing our footprint. Congress, through the appropriations, has directed us.
We need to move on to the next.
Can we keep talking after this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The gentlelady yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Administrator Wheeler, for being here today. I want to talk to you about a serious threat to the public's health that affects potentially millions of Southern Californians from Riverside County all the way to LA County and Imperial County. The Salton Sea is California's largest inland body of water, and it's shrinking. The exposed playa have very fine dust, particulate matter, that's contaminated with agricultural runoff and other toxins that if they get into the air, it can easily penetrate the lung-blood barrier. I'm a doctor, so I can follow the path. And such exposure is associated with premature death, as well as asthma attacks, chronic bronchitis, decreased lung function, and respiratory disease. All of this leads to increased hospitalization, emergency room trips, and doctor visits. In fact, the surrounding community already has the highest pediatric asthma hospitalization rate in the entire state of California. So this pollution, in fact, disproportionately affects the most vulnerable among us: infants, children, seniors, and low-income families. So fine particle pollution is harmful to human health, even at very low concentrations, and it makes sense. We don't want chemically contaminated dust or particles or any dust in our blood. The scientific consensus recognized by hundreds of peer-reviewed articles and by EPA administrators during both Republican and Democratic administration says that fine particle pollution is a so-called non-threshold pollutant. That means that any level of fine particle pollution exposure can cause harm. At our December 2017 hearing, then Administrator Pruitt agreed that fine particle pollution was a no-threshold pollutant. Administrator Willie, do you agree that fine particle pollution is a non-threshold pollutant?
I believe most of the science directs us that way, yes.
So yes, good. Will the EPA officially acknowledge that the presence of fine particulate matter at any threshold is a public health hazard?
We are currently in the middle of our NAAQS review for PM. It's scheduled to be completed by the end of 2020. KSAC is currently reviewing the PM science that the agency supplied.
Okay.
We expect to have a report back from KSAC, so I would like to defer until I
Well, you just said that any amount of particle matter and dust, especially those with chemicals, that gets into our blood is harmful to our health.
I believe there's still science as far as what is the composition of the particles, whether or not certain compositions have better.
I'll tell you the composition of any particle that is small enough to enter the alveolar blood barrier is harmful to your health. There's no foreign body that is in our blood that is helpful to our human health.
I will defer to you on the medicine, but it's my understanding.
So listen, when you consider this,
composition of the PM is important.
Yeah, know that any foreign body in your blood, regardless of the composition, if it can get into your blood system, it's bad for your health. You know that.
Yes.
The Clean Power Plan rule includes a policy that particulate matter is a non-threshold pollutant, yet the EPA is in the process of repealing that rule. So consider that rule when, and that part of that rule when you look at this, this science as well. So
the Supreme Court stayed that rule. Excellent. By repealing the Clean Power Plan, the EPA could potentially, for the first time, say that any level is safe. So I'm glad that the Supreme Court, in fact, agrees with us. So let me move on to another issue. And part of the reason that fine particulate matter from the Salton Sea lake bed is so dangerous is because the sea is partially fed by agricultural runoff and from sources like the New River, one of the dirtiest, most polluted rivers in the country. It contains toxins, wastes, and parts from animal products and chemical runoff from companies and carcinogens like DDT. My office was recently contacted by constituents who work as CBP officers stationed at Riverside, Imperial County, who have suffered from respiratory illnesses, skin rashes, symptomatic exposure of toxins and harmful chemicals. Some have been diagnosed with chemicals. Many came concerned about their future, their health. A childhood friend of mine, Hector Acosta, also concerned about what would happen with him. Will he come down with cancer as well? They recently wrote a letter requesting your support for an epidemiological study. Will you commit to working with CBP to study the potential hazards of exposure to the New River, including conducting an epidemiological study to ensure that our public safety officers and their families are protected? We'll have to look into that. I'm not sure if that's an EPA or an ATSDR, but...
Great. So will you provide me an answer by June 1st?
Yes.
Great. And before I close, I want to submit this GAO study that I recently asked GAO to do regarding EPA's meaningful consultation with tribes regarding Superfund consultation and management. They gave you a set of recommendations. I'd like you to take a look at them and see if you can respond to those recommendations. I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without objection? Okay, well included. Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the full committee, the representative from New York, Representative Yvette Clark.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and Administrator Wheeler. I have some very serious concerns about the EPA's being run by former lobbyists, setting the rules for former clients. Your calendars revealed that since joining the agency, you have frequently met with companies you've once represented. I want to be clear. I'm concerned about the ethical and possible conflicts of interest because the mission of the EPA is so important to the health and safety of my constituents and the public nationwide. EPA plays an essential role in safeguarding us, and the agency should not be for sale. Let me focus on just one example. The EPA's Risk Management Planning Program, the so-called, or also called RPM, RMP. The RMP program offers important protections for workers, first responders, and the communities around high-risk chemical facilities. Mr. Wheeler, is my understanding that you're pursuing rulemaking to weaken the RMP program at the urging of industry. But so long as the requirements are on the books, will you commit to aggressively enforcing them?
First of all, Congressman, yes, absolutely, but we're not moving to weaken the RMP program at all. And I don't know what you're referring to on meeting with former clients. I've not met with any of my former clients under my recusal statements. And I've followed the career advice of the EPA ethics officials, and I'm really not sure what you're referring to on that.
Well, I'm not going to get into a back and forth. That's something we can discuss. I've got a short amount of time.
But that goes to my personal integrity. So
I got you. Sure. We will follow up with you on that. More than 9.1 million people live in the vulnerability zones of RMP facilities in my home state of New York, meaning more than half of the state's population is at risk from accidents of those facilities. That's why the Attorney General of New York State recently led a coalition of 12 state attorney generals opposing EPA's proposed rollback of RPM protections. Your proposed rulemaking would diminish requirements for prevention, consideration of safer alternatives, third-party audits, transparency, coordination with first responders, and more. These common sense requirements should not be removed. In the past month, the Houston area has seen 2 large fires at RMP facilities, the ITC Deer Park facility and the KMCO facility in Crosby. Both fires created significant disruptions with shelter-in-place requirements and large plumes of black toxic smoke. Mr. Wheeler, are you aware that the Deer Park facility was cited for violations of the RMP program in 2015, and some of those violations stemmed from a lack of proper prevention?
Yes, and we have been working with that, with the community involved. I do want to point out on the RMP program, last year we had the largest ever settlement in the history of enforcing under the RPM program.
Well, I think we should be doing more to prevent disasters, right? That's what that whole protocol is about. Mr. Wheeler, will you commit to strengthening the prevention requirements of the RMP program rather than weakening them?
I don't believe we are weakening them, Congresswoman.
So you don't commit to strengthening them?
We are enforcing them more vigorously.
You're enforcing them. I'm asking whether you would strengthen them.
We are in the middle of a rulemaking process to reconsider certain provisions of the RMP.
All right, let me go on to my next question, because clearly you're not interested in strengthening them. Are you aware that the facility also has extensive violations of the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act? That is the Deer Park facility.
Yes, I am aware of that.
Okay. I don't think a facility with that record of compliance should be trusted to protect surrounding communities. Will you commit to finalizing an RMP rule that preserves the third-party audit requirements?
Yes.
Thank you. I just think weakening a program that protects 9.1 million people in New York because the regulated industry asks you to is not your job. As an administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, industry may have been there for you before, but you work for the people now, and you should be looking out for all of us. I hope that you will reconsider the strengthening of the protections of the RMP program. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the state of Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wheeler, thank you for being here. It's good to see you. We appreciate you taking time to come talk to us. I wanted to talk very quickly about the district I represent. It's the 1st Congressional District of Georgia. And we have 2 major seaports, as you know, the Port of Savannah, the #2 container port on the eastern seaboard, the Port of Brunswick, which is the #2 roll-on, roll-off port in the country. Both of these are extremely important to the economic well-being of the southeast United States. The Port of Savannah and of Brunswick are 2 of the major economic engines of the southeast, and it's very important that we keep those going. One of the things that I've spoken to you about in the past has been the bar pilots that are so very important in escorting the ships in and out of the harbor. And the requirement now that they utilize the Tier 4 engines. Now, we've had EPA personnel go out to the manufacturers that make the boats that they are required, that harbor pilots are required to have, and meet with them. And they've said, look, we cannot meet these requirements. And EPA has agreed. And it's my understanding that through the rulemaking process that you're going to correct this. Can you tell me where we're at right now in the rulemaking process dealing with the Tier 4 engines?
Yes, we've submitted the rule to OMB, and that should be going out for public comment shortly.
Can you give me an idea about how long the OMB process may take? Because obviously this is very urgent on our part.
I'm not sure if it's a 30 or 60-day review by OMB, but I'll check into that and get back to you, sir.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. This is a step in the right direction, changing the rules, but time is of the essence. I just hope that everyone understands that, because it just simply cannot be done. And the Tier 4 engines, I might add, is impacting other areas. We have a strong ag presence in our district as well. And now the farmers are telling us that they actually cannot get the Tier 4 engines onto the tractors and use the type of wheels that they need to use in their process. So I hope that this will be something you'll be looking at as well.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. If we could kind of shift gears now about the Superfund sites. In my district, and particularly in one area, we have a county, Glenn County, that has 4 Superfund sites, and it's of major concern. In fact, last year you will remember that I hand-delivered a letter to you about one of them that the Department of Justice and EPA have ruled on, the Terry Creek site in Brunswick, Georgia. It's the Hercules site. The Hercules plant used to be on that. And last September, I gave you a letter, as I say, asking you to work together with the Department of Justice to address some of the concerns that the local community had about the consent decree and the remediation plans. Do you know, or can you tell me what actions have been taken on the consent decree to alleviate some of the concerns that the community leaders have?
I believe their concerns have been addressed, and I'm also told that that consent decree should be finalized in the next month or so. But I'll make sure, and I'll go back and make sure that their concerns have been addressed.
Do you work with the Department of Justice on this? Whose jurisdiction, who's going to be making the final decision?
It's a collaborative process between EPA and the Department of Justice on working on the consent decrees for Superfund sites.
Okay. I'm very concerned also because two of these sites in Brunswick, in that area, one of them has had this designation of construction complete, and that designation has been on there for 20 years. Is that correct? Am I wrong on that? Or?
It might be. Part of my frustration why we're putting such an emphasis on getting these Superfund sites cleaned up is because when they're on the national priority list for decades, that means it's not a priority. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we delisted 22 sites last year, the most since 2005. We've made it a priority at the agency to move these sites, to get them cleaned up and get them cleaned up quickly. Again, if something is on the national priority list for decades, then by definition, that's not a priority.
This is, a major concern to this community. I've met with the community leaders, and, they have big plans for some of these areas, but they can't. For instance, they're looking to build a school. We can't build a school on a site like this unless we know it's been remediated, unless we know it's safe. I mean, that's just irresponsible. So I hope that I can get your commitment that you'll pay particular attention to this. I recognize that it would be unfair to ask you to speak on this specific site, that you're probably not prepared for that, but at the same time, I hope that you'll take that back and perhaps have your staff get in touch with me.
Happy to do that, sir.
Okay. Finally, I want to talk about biobutanol. That is something that is very important to us on the coast because, as you know, the impact that particular fuel has on marine engines is less severe than some of the other fuels that are out there. And I know that the agency has been grappling with the proposal on year-round E15, but what consumer protections can we expect you to see for boaters and other small engine operators to prevent misfueling and educate them on alternatives like biobutanol?
Well, we do work with the gasoline stations, the oil companies to make sure that it's properly labeled, and to try to make sure through education efforts and through to make sure that when you have boats that it's labeled correctly and that people are not putting the wrong fuel into their vehicles or boats.
Okay. All right. I've got just about a minute left. Just to recap, Mr. Wheeler, Tier 4 engines, Superfund sites, biobutanol. Okay? And I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Ranking Member Shimkus.
Well, I thank my colleague, and I'll just be brief. I was going to raise a point of order, but since I'm just going to get this last minute, Mr. Chairman, I think I want to, and I know there's the art of legal language. I just want us to be careful to use that to make accusations that we have no proven connection to, no stories, no legal actions. Administrator Wheeler has served 22 of his 30 years in the public service, in the EPA chemical office for 5 years, serving in the EPW, and now it's on the Senate side, so we could attack you for that. But 15 years, and then in the private practice for 8, and then here for 2 years. So I would caution my colleagues. I'll be the first when there's real things to point to. That's a fair game, but innuendos I'd be careful of. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Let's now move to the gentleman from Maryland, Representative Sarbanes. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the opportunity to wave on to the committee today. Administrator Wheeler, I wanted to talk about the Chesapeake Bay. You won't be surprised to hear that. Being a representative from Maryland and having been a champion of the Bay really since I was a little kid crabbing on the Nanticoke River on the Eastern Shore, but having that opportunity obviously since I came to Congress, and I'm extremely distressed at this continued run that the administration is taking at the funding for the Chesapeake Bay in many different respects. I'll focus primarily today on the Chesapeake Bay program. As you know, the President in his budget 2 years ago proposed to completely zero out funding for the Chesapeake Bay program. Last year he proposed a 90% cut to the funding for the Chesapeake Bay program at EPA, and has done the same thing with the budget proposal this year. And obviously that would have a huge impact on our restoration efforts for the Chesapeake Bay. There are nearly 50 members of Congress here whose districts intersect with the Chesapeake Bay watershed. There's 17 million residents of the Bay watershed, 64,000 square miles within the watershed. And the resource that represents, not just as a national and a natural treasure, but in terms of the economic engine that it represents for Maryland and for the region, really cannot be overstated. So the proposal to come again with this kind of cut, and I will, as you know, over the last 2 years, in response to that, there's been a bipartisan push back on the part of members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who understand how valuable the program is to all of the states involved, but really to our country overall. So I wanted to ask you to comment on these cuts. I know that there were similar proposed draconian cuts made with respect to funding of the Great Lakes restoration efforts, and since the budget's come down, you and the President have now kind of reversed the position on the Great Lakes and are indicating that funding will be restored, or that you're interested in having Congress restore that funding, but we haven't had the same kind of declaration or commitment made with respect to the Chesapeake Bay. So I'd ask you to comment on that, please.
Certainly, Congressman. And first of all, I live in a Chesapeake resource protection area. I'm fully committed to the Bay and making sure that the health of the Bay continues to improve. The geographic program areas is just one area of funding that we use to help restore the Chesapeake Bay. We have other Clean Water Act programs, as well as the source water protection programs authorized under the Safe Drinking Water Act to protect the watershed, and including the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System Program, water quality trading, and also our work involving the harmful algae blooms. Also last month, I signed a WIFIA loan for the City of Baltimore for $202 million that will go a long ways to helping to clean up the Bay. So we have a number of different programs, aside from the geographic specific programs that we can use, and we do use, to not only help the Chesapeake Bay, but the Great Lakes, the Puget Sound, a number of watersheds all around the country. We're not limited to our programs to the geographic programs. We have a lot of other tools in our disposal.
Well, I certainly appreciate you have those other tools, and maintaining commitment to them is really important, but the Bay program that the EPA funds and supports is really critical, because it's a leveraging program, and the amount of expertise that has been assembled in the program with respect to restoring the Chesapeake Bay is tremendous over the last few years. You're going to, I think, encounter the same kind of response that you saw from Congress over the last couple of years with respect to that proposed cut. And I would just encourage you to do the kind of reevaluation that we've seen with respect to the Great Lakes restoration efforts as you're looking at the Chesapeake Bay, because I would think that the administration would want to be on the correct side of this issue in terms of maintaining critical momentum with respect to the restoration that has happened, and largely because of that leveraging resource that has been represented by the Chesapeake Bay program. So we urge you, we beseech you to take a position of restoring that funding. You can rest assured that that's the position that we're going to assemble here in Congress on a bipartisan basis. And with that, I yield back my time.
We will utilize all the funds that Congress gives us for the Bay.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Representative. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to wave onto this subcommittee, and I admire the clairvoyance of my friend, Mr. Shimkus. I am indeed going to ask you about the renewable fuel standard. Mr. Wheeler, I'm going to get right to my questions. Mr. Wheeler, have the 39 small refinery waiver requests that were at DOE last week been sent to you folks at EPA yet?
I don't believe the formal waiver requests have been sent. We've received a list from the Department.
Do you expect to grant any or all of these waivers going forward?
We will certainly take the advice of the Department of Energy into account. In the past, we've taken their advice in all but one instance.
Now looking forward, do you expect that you will have to grant any small refinery waivers for 2019, or what about 2020?
Well, it would depend on the data each year and whether or not the small refineries have a hardship based upon the information in the data. You know, part of that is the price of RIN.
Yeah, this has been hugely controversial, as you know, in corn country because of the waivers. What's clear to me, unfortunately, is that this particular EPA, under your predecessor, hopefully that won't be the case under you, is committed to granting small refinery waivers. And every year since 2013, we've seen these waivers. But the explosion in the last few years has been prolific, and it appears to the American people that if a refiner applies for a waiver, it basically is guaranteed to get one, unfortunately. Just to be perfectly clear, Mr. Administrator, when you waive over you and your predecessor waive over 2.6 billion gallons of biofuels and counting, you are harming the biofuels industry, an industry that, as you know, is an economic driver in districts like mine in Iowa and throughout the Midwest, throughout corn country generally. The EPA has failed to do anything to reallocate this demand destruction. Your agency has expressly refused to take comments on a possible reallocation in the 2019-2020 RVO. You refuse to acknowledge the likelihood of waivers in rulemaking when it is clear the refiners will continue to submit applications, and you all will keep granting them, especially under this administration, one that has prolifically, I have to say, handed out over 54 waivers to the oil industry so far. What is the agency doing, if anything, to restore the 2.6 billion gallons of lost biofuel demand?
We are looking into that, but I would point out that when the agency was not issuing the waivers, we were sued 3 times and we lost all 3 cases. So
well, is there any statutory prohibition on reallocating the wave volumes?
After we've set the RVOs for a year, we can't go back and modify the RVO numbers, and the waiver requests come in after the RVO numbers are set.
Would it be easier to reallocate the gallons if you're able to determine this so-called hardship earlier in the compliance year? Do you have the ability to do that?
Yes, we would have the ability to do that, but again, we don't receive the request for the waivers until after the RVOs are set.
If you got them done earlier in the year, could you then potentially use the RVO to account for these waivers, even as an estimate?
It's not a factor of us getting them done earlier because we don't receive them from the small refineries.
And I just have one final question, Mr. Wheeler, and it's a yes or no question. Do you acknowledge that when ethanol and biodiesel plants suffer when you grant small refinery exemptions, that the farmers who grow the corn and the soybeans for ethanol and biodiesel are harmed as well?
Yes, they are, but that's why we're also moving forward to grant the E15 year-round to provide greater markets for the ethanol.
I certainly hope so, too, and I do appreciate that.
We hope to have that finished in time for the summer driving season.
And we're looking forward to that because I think the best way to deal with that issue is through regulation, obviously. Mr. Chairman, this EPA, I believe, has been egregiously undermining the biofuels industry and hurting farmers across the country. This is what I hear from farmers every time I talk to them, quite honestly. These actions continue. If these actions continue, they'll do irreparable harm to the economy in my state and other states, especially in corn and soybean country. I'm going to continue to exert my oversight role as I have today. Certainly, I hope that this administration looks more favorably on our corn growers, our soybean growers, and much less favorably on big oil going forward. So thank you, and I do yield back. Thank you.
Representative Lopsack yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Representative O'Halloran, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to waver on. I want to discuss, Mr. Wheeler, my concerns about the pace of cleanup of the over 520 uranium mine sites on the Navajo Nation Reservation and the available EPA resources to resolve this crisis. This crisis was created by the federal government. This crisis has, the Navajo Nation had nothing to do with this process. You'll see a map on the screen identifying the sites, and most of them are nearby waterways or washes. While these mines are no longer operating, the lingering high levels of radiation, as admitted to by the EPA, are still causing a devastating effect to the health of Navajo people in my district. Remediation of these sites to reduce toxic exposures and ensure access to safe drinking water is moving too slowly. In fact, the monitoring systems aren't even in place right now. That's a USGS issue. In part because too few resources, such as staff and funding, are being devoted to completing these difficult work. I cannot see how proposals for deep cuts in funding and staffing can maintain progress, let alone increase its pace. The Navajo people already have waited decades for help in cleaning up this dangerous pollution, and they deserve a resolution. Administrator Wheeler, how does the EPA justify its 15% proposed cut around $115 million to the Superfund program for hazardous site cleanups for fiscal year 2020?
Congressman, we are trying to balance a number of competing interests within the EPA budget to try to reduce the overall federal expenditures. But one thing we are doing on the Superfund program is going after the responsible parties at a higher level. We had more recoveries last year from PRPs than previous years, which will hopefully free up more Superfund dollars to address other sites such as the Navajo Nation.
In this case, I believe that waiting for that time is costing people's lives and children's quality of life and their potential for life and death issues. But I also know that there is Superfund money there and you haven't been using it appropriately. After congressional pressure years ago, it seemed like progress was being made by the EPA in the creation of 5-year plans for uranium mine cleanups, which EPA released in 2008 and 2014. Did the EPA meet the goals it set for itself in this latest 5-year plan, which recently ended in 2018, and was enough budgeted to fulfill these goals?
If you don't mind, sir, I'd like to respond for the record on that question.
Okay. Further, the EPA Inspector General's office reported in August of last year that EPA had not finished developing the prioritization methodology for the 54 sites included in the settlements as of June 2018. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record the Inspector General's report on this issue, report number 18P0233. Also in this report, EPA Regions 6 and 9 noted that they intend to follow through with their site cleanup contaminants and stay on schedule, but that the task completion dates are subject to available resources, staffing, and that both offices were operating with too few employees. In fact, both 5-year plans, there was no money requested from the EPA in addition to your regular budget, and frankly, the 10-year plan that's coming up does not request it either. Frankly, I'm disheartened that the funds currently available for mine cleanup, so few sites have been cleaned to date, even where funds are available to do the work, as with the settlement fund for the Tornex mines. It seems there are still too few resources at EPA to move this work forward, and many other projects that have been discussed here today. I do appreciate the EPA's process for site evaluation and tribal consultation, but the sense of urgency towards this crisis appears to be lacking in my view. In fact, I think it's disrespectful to the people that are impacted by this, and the responsibility of federal government is being made by this administration or prior. Mr. Chairman, with this information presented, I believe we, as a committee, ought to request the EPA come in for a thorough follow-up briefing on this matter. Mr. Wheeler, will you commit to an agency briefing before this committee on the status of the uranium mine cleanups?
Yes, I would.
I realize this is a complex and difficult task, but we should be able to make much better progress than we have been. Almost 80 years is way too long to have the Navajo Nation, the water resources of the Navajo Nation, and the Colorado River potentially impacted because of our negligence. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Administrator Wheeler, on the fuel economy proposal, I want to note that EPA's internal analysis corrected many flaws in the modeling underlying the proposed rule, and after doing so, EPA career staff concluded that instead of saving lives, the proposed rule would actually increase fatalities. And also, again, we thank you for appearing before the subcommittee today, and I know that you have made
Mr.
some
Chairman.
comments. Yes, sir.
Can I see the site for that analysis that you just read?
It's in the administrative record.
I'm not familiar with that, but I would like to
Thank you.
respond for the record on that. I'm not familiar with that information.
So again, we thank you for appearing before the subcommittee today. I know you made some commitments to respond to members' requests today. I hope we can receive those responses along with answers to questions for the record in a reasonable amount of time, including confirmation that the TSCA risk evaluation was sent to the National Academies of Science. I would also mention a letter. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this one, that we sent a letter to EPA with Representatives Dingell, Lujan, and Welch back in December on PFAS chemicals and the TSCA program. I hope we can receive that information in the near future because this committee intends to work on PFAS this year. The 70 parts per trillion health advisory level is not a standard and it is not enforceable. So I hope EPA will provide us with the assistance necessary for us to move forward with all available information. And in regard to that December letter, might it be more specific and direct? Since you've had that for months, I would ask that we receive a detailed response within 7 working days.
We will give you a response, yes.
Within 7 working days?
I will have to check with the staff.
Mr. Chairman, are we going to a second round? Is that where we're headed?
No, I just wanted a response to our letter of December.
Thank you.
And I think we are owed a response, and I would appreciate a 7-day time frame, working day time frame by which to respond.
I hear you. I need to check on the status of that response. We have responded. I believe we've received 8 committee letters.
This is a December letter, Mr. Administrator, so I don't think we're being unfair. 7 working days?
I will have to see where we are on the response. We'll get it.
Can you give us an update in 7 working days?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, are we going to go to a second round?
We're
Because
not going to a second round. I just want to get a commitment to get a response to a letter from December.
It's 5 and 5, so.
Okay, we have a number of documents that we asked to be for unanimous consent to enter into the record. They include a fact sheet from the Colorado Oil and Gas Association on the state's air quality advancements, an opinion letter submitted to the Gainesville Sun titled "Attacks on Science Are a Threat to Our Water," a February 2019 report by the GAO entitled "Superfund, EPA Should Improve the Reliability of Data on National Priorities, List Sites Affecting Indian Tribes," a letter from various public health groups entitled "Climate Change is a Health Emergency, a Declaration on Climate Change and Health," an EPA Inspector General report on uranium mine sites on Navajo lands from August 2018, and finally a map from the EPA Inspector General report. Again, request unanimous consent to enter the following into the record.
Without objection, Mr. Chairman.
So moved. And so with that, again, we thank you, Administrator Wheeler. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witness. Mr. Wheeler, I ask you to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. At this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.